Jesus says in Matthew 5:11, "Blessed are you when others revile you and persecute you and utter all kinds of evil against you falsely on my account." Jesus said persecution is part of the package. But what does it mean to be a Christian and persecuted in the United States today? Are Christians hated because we're a bunch of self-righteous, hypocritical bigots? If persecution is part of the package, what do you expect to be hated for? This week on the Weekly Disruption. Hey everyone, welcome to the Weekly Disruption podcast, a weekly dose of biblical truth to cut through the cultural noise. I'm your host, Chris Hemmelman, pastor of First City Church in Bellevue, Nebraska. This is our third episode of a 3-episode drop to kick off this brand new podcast. So if you have not listened to our first 2 episodes, please go back and do so. First episode, I talk about the vision and sort of the reason behind this podcast. And the second one, I get into the not so controversial topic of whether Christians should attend gay weddings or not. If that humor was a little too subtle for you, I was being sarcastic. If you are a Christian, what do you expect to be hated for? Jesus promises hatred, opposition, even persecution. Those are part of the package. But where do we expect that opposition to come from? Now, I want to be clear here. When we're talking about persecution, we have to be careful because there's one sense Christians in the United States today are not facing persecution. It is not illegal to practice Christianity in our country. We can gather freely to worship. Consider that the guy who is second in line to the presidency of the United States is an outspoken, strong, evangelical Christian. And so there are ways in which we are not experiencing persecution in our country like our brothers and sisters in places like the Middle East or North Korea or China. To say that we face outright persecution is a gross overstatement and isn't accurate of what's actually happening. But it's important that we are accurate because the only way that we're going to properly face and address what we are experiencing is if we are accurately assessing the situation on the ground. If it's not outright persecution that we're facing, what is it that we're facing? Well, I think it's important to note that there are instances in our country where the practicing of the Christian faith does run into legal problems. So I think of the several photographers and bakers that have been in the news who were sued by clients because they refused to do photography or bake a cake for a gay wedding. Also thinking about a group that was recently prosecuted for protesting in an abortion clinic, and they're facing up to 11 years in prison. And so there are some ways where the practice of our faith can run into some serious legal repercussions. Now, to be sure, those are bad laws that need to change, but we also have to recognize that these instances are unique and they're limited. They don't speak of the widespread experience of most Christians in our country. These things do tell us something, though. They highlight that a shift has taken place in our country and in our society that is super important for us to recognize. Cultural commentator and author Aaron Renn has made the argument that when it comes to the relationship between Christianity and the culture of the U.S., that relationship has existed in 3 major phases. He wrote about this idea in an article from First Things magazine, which I'm going to be quoting from for this podcast, but he also recently released a book called Life in the Negative World that also talks about this dynamic. So according to Renn, there are 3 major phases that you can use to describe the relationship between Christianity and the culture of the U.S. This first phase is essentially pre-1994, so the history of our country prior to 1994. And he calls this the positive world. And here's how he describes the positive world. Society at large retains a mostly positive view of Christianity. To be known as a good church-going man remains part of being an upstanding citizen. Publicly being a Christian is a status enhancer. Christian moral norms are the basic moral norms of society, and violating them can bring negative consequences. Now, this is not to say that our culture was entirely Christian and there weren't problematic aspects of our culture. But it is to say that the posture of Christianity toward Christianity in our culture was largely positive. It was a cultural good. It actually benefited you in society. And even think about presidential elections that the candidate wanted to put their faith forward. There was a sense of that being a person of faith was a net benefit to being a public official. So positive world is the first phase. Second phase is what he calls the neutral world. And so this is essentially 1994 to about 2014. And here's how he describes the neutral world. Society takes a neutral stance towards Christianity. Christianity no longer has privileged status, but is not disfavored. Being publicly known as a Christian has neither a positive nor a negative impact on one's social status. Christianity is a valid option within a pluralistic public square. Christian moral norms retain some residual effect. So here is where you get more into kind of that postmodern, I'm okay, you're okay, that's true for you, but not true for you mentality. So Christianity still had a place in society, but it wasn't given a privileged place so much anymore. People weren't necessarily outright hostile to it at a societal level, but they would also say, well, yeah, that's good for you, that's true for you, but I choose to believe something else. And so it was more neutral, where there wasn't the hostility, but there wasn't the full-on embrace, and it didn't have the same positive cultural capital. Next, Wren describes the current phase that we are in, which is called the negative world. And he says this roughly started around 2014, 2015, and is our current time. And here's how he describes the negative world. Society has come to have a negative view of Christianity. Being known as a Christian is a social negative, particularly in the elite domains of society. Christian morality is expressly repudiated and seen as a threat to the public good and the new public moral order. Subscribing to Christian moral views or violating the secular moral order brings negative consequences. Now, it is not too hard to see how this description of the negative world is our current reality. And really, you see this shift start to take place, as Aaron Wren will point out, around 2014, 2015. And really the catalyst, the turn towards the negative world was the Obergefell ruling by the Supreme Court, which legalized same-sex marriage. And so at that point, you had sort of this pretty steady and persistent and consistent drift towards more and more of a negative posture towards Christianity. Because if Christian moral values were holding back the rights of the gay and lesbian community to get married, then Christianity is actually a danger and a threat to a democratic society. And so from that point forward, we saw the posture towards Christianity, especially in places of elite society and governmental power, as a threat, as a danger. And so if you are going to express and practice biblical norms, biblical standards, which had been the standards of society for hundreds of years, you are now seen as a danger. And really, it was from that decision in 2015, that Supreme Court decision in 2015, that the dominoes really started to fall. And because you better believe that you can draw a straight line from that Supreme Court decision to the transgender movement and ideology that we are facing down today. Going back to those instances of persecution where Christians ran into legal trouble because of the exercise of their faith. What was happening there? That society and the legal system decided that Christian morality and Christian principles were actually seen as a threat, as a detriment to society. This is life in the negative world. So even if we aren't facing outright persecution like our brothers and sisters in places like North Korea and China and the Middle East, a shift has taken place in our society. There is a movement in our culture to push Christians more and more to the margins of society, that we would practice our faith more and more in private and less out in the public square. If they can't outright outlaw Christianity and our free practice of worship, they can create systems and structures to make it really hard for Christians to participate and even be seen as a cultural good in society. I mean, think of some of the cases that have happened recently where Christians have been barred from participating in foster parenting. There was a case out in Oregon where a particular woman was rejected because she refused to say that she would uphold transgender ideology and a trans-affirming stance towards children. And so what we see here is that Christian faith is being ostracized more and more. There is a sense in which Christian faith is not just this, well, that's true for you, but I kind of do my own thing. Now it's, no, you're a bigot. You're a danger. You're someone that needs to be pushed to the margin of society and not allowed to practice your faith because you're discriminatory and you're going to withhold rights from other people, and there's going to actually cause damage to our societal order. So the shift in the negative world has changed the posture towards Christianity. Not just something that is tolerated, not something that is just sort of neutral, but actually something that is seen as a threat. So within this negative world, where our faith is being more and more pushed to the sidelines and more seen as a threat to the good of society, how can we expect to be hated? What are the ways in which Christians are going to experience opposition? So to answer this question, I want to pull in another article from Rhys Laverty, who's writing in the New Albion. This is a publication that primarily deals with Christianity in the UK. But I think his insights here are very applicable to life here in the United States. Here's what he writes. When I was in secondary school, which he says was from 2004 to 2011, so roughly in the neutral world timeframe, I think there were generally three things which would rile people up when it came to my faith. The first was the exclusivity of the gospel, telling people that we were all sinners in need of saving, whose good works counted for nothing, and who could only be saved by faith in Christ, offended even the sensibilities of my fellow teenage boys. The second was personal piety. I was doubtless not as good a witness on this score, but in God's goodness, my relatively pious lifestyle was evident enough to generate a good deal of mockery. The third, closely related to the second, was personal love for Jesus. The most mockery I ever received was after introducing some friends to DC Talk's Jesus Freak while on a school residential. Perhaps not the best idea in hindsight, admittedly. They found it eye-wateringly hilarious. The idea of expressing specific and personal devotion to Jesus of Nazareth, of saying, I love Jesus or I'm a Jesus freak, was just too much. Now, I can relate to some of Rhys's experiences that he describes here. I became a Christian in the spring of 1994 when I was 14. In many ways, my life didn't change dramatically. I was a good kid in a lot of ways, and so there wasn't any necessarily outwardly radical behavior changes when I became a Christian. Most of the change that I experienced was very much in my internal world in a lot of ways. Now, there were some things that did change. Like I stopped swearing as much as I did. I stopped telling dirty jokes, the way that I talked about girls. So there were some things that I did with my mouth that definitely changed. But the biggest change really came in the ways that I talked about going to church or talking about how I was devoted to Christ and loved Jesus. So some of those, just that kind of personal piety, personal relationship with Christ, I would start to talk about more and more with my friends. And it was in my freshman year that I started to experience some of the opposition that Rhys Laverty mentions here in his article. It wasn't vicious or malicious, but I got called the religious kid or the good kid because of my faith. And it was kind of the thing that I got teased about by my friends. Just like you might tease your friend about some dynamic or something about him, that was kind of what I got teased about. And there were two stories that really stick out in my mind that kind of illustrate Rhys Laverty's point here. One was during basketball practice during my freshman year, was in a line for a drill and was one of the kids on the team who I was pretty good friends with. We were just kind of joking back and forth, and he was giving me a hard time, and he calls me church kid. And so then I turn and I look at him and I go, yeah, and church kid starts over you, doesn't he? And so it was just a fun little moment where we were just giving each other a hard time, but it was just kind of this moment where I got teased for my faith, for being sincere in my faith. And then there was another instance where I was sitting in class, and back then you kind of had those desks that you sat in, and there was like a basket underneath the desk that you could put your books in when you went from class to class. And so I had my books under there, and on top of them I had this historical novel about Jesus. And I don't remember the exact title of it, but it said Jesus on it. It was something. And the kid sitting next to me again, he was kind of a friend of mine, so had a good relationship with him. And he kind of looked down and he noticed it, and he starts laughing and he grabs it and he goes, "What is this? Why are you reading this?" And I don't remember what I said to him, but it was again this kind of moment where a book that I had that was an expression of my personal devotion to Christ and my love for Jesus was called out and was seen as something that was weird. Like, why would you have a book about Jesus in your stack of books? Now, in my small Nebraska town, Christianity was not viewed in this overly negative way. My context was very much what you would consider a positive world context. I had friends that maybe they weren't super pious, but they went to church. We didn't have practices on Wednesdays because kids had to go to religious education classes. And so there was a way in which being a Christian was not overly difficult in the town that I grew up in. I also was relatively successful in sports, and so I was on a lot of sports teams and did well and developed friendships there. And I also tried not to be a jerk about my faith, and so even after I became a Christian, maintained good friendships with guys in my town and on my team. And so there was a lot of ways in which my experience of opposition was pretty mild and pretty tame. The type of opposition and hatred Laverty describes here is what he calls being hated for grace. Think of this in the terms of the grace of the gospel. Tell someone that they are a sinner in need of salvation and that they cannot save themselves through their own good works, but they need the grace of God through Jesus Christ, and our sinful hearts will buck against that. Call someone to love and devotion and loyalty to Christ above all other things, and our sinful, selfish, prideful hearts will rebel against that notion. Crazy as it may sound, in our sin, we actually hate the grace of God because in and of ourselves, we hate Him and we hate our need for Him. And for evangelicals who are raised in a positive world or a neutral world context, being hated for grace is not something that is out of the ordinary. It's not something that we are surprised by. We have been taught, whether through sermons or through Sunday school class or evangelism class, that when we share the gospel, we should expect opposition. When we talk to people about their need to turn from their sin and trust in the grace of God and that they cannot save themselves, we knew that people would push back against that. When we talk about our love and our devotion and our loyalty to Jesus, when we talk about singing to Him and worshiping Him, that people were going to look at us as being odd and crazy. This was our expectation, to be hated for grace. But as Laverty goes to point out, what we are hated for today in the negative world is something different. It's not so much grace, even though we still are hated for grace, but it is more being hated for nature. Here's what he writes. We no longer live in a world which simply hates grace. We live in a world which hates nature. And understanding this fact is one of the most urgent priorities in Christian discipleship today. The primary cause of Christians' negative social capital is no longer exclusivity, piety, or devotion. It is nature. The Christian faith requires confession of the gospel, but it also requires confession of creation. I believe in one God, the Father, the Almighty, maker of heaven and earth, and all that is seen and unseen. So begins the Nicene Creed. We all are witnesses not simply to the fact that God has acted to redeem the world, but that He created it in the first place, insisting that there is such a thing as reality, and that this is evident to all human beings, has been baked into Christianity from day one. The reality of reality, however, is no longer a settled fact. In a technocratic age in which the digital world divorces us from the limiting factors which have defined human identity throughout all of history, all things can be remade. There is no such as a human nature which should determine our behavior and rein us in. Hated not only for grace, but also nature. And here is what is challenging about this reality. We have not been taught to expect to be hated for nature. Taught to be hated for grace, yes. That's our expectation. That's normal. That feels like part of the package for us. But now to be hated for nature, this feels like a strange new reality for us, and we don't entirely know what to do with it. To be hated for saying that there is a created order, that male and female are biological realities that are fixed and cannot be changed. This is a new frontier for us. Things that were accepted by society and by the world and by people throughout human history are now challenged, are now thrown up in question, in doubt. And yet here we are holding the line on nature, holding the line in reality, holding the line on created order and biology. And rather than people just going, well, yeah, duh, that's obvious, now we are hated for it. Now we're called bigots. Now we're seen as threats to society because we acknowledge what is real. When I was in high school, all of my non-Christian friends would have agreed that male and female are biological realities that cannot be changed. And they would have laughed and mocked at anyone who said otherwise. In the small town that I grew up in, homosexuality and homosexual practice was seen as aberrant, even by non-Christians. And so it was never laughed at or mocked or made fun of for upholding nature. Things today are vastly different. Society has rapidly changed so that social etiquette and social respectability now demand that you affirm homosexual practice and transgendered identity. To say that male and female are fixed realities or biological realities that cannot be changed, to say that marriage is only between a man and a woman, that will put you in the same category reserved for racists and bigots today. And this messes with us, doesn't it? This stirs in us this sense of, well, hey, I don't want to be called a bigot, and I didn't expect to be called a bigot, and so we don't know entirely what to do with this sometimes. And here's what ends up happening. Here's what I'm afraid of, is we end up going silent on this issue because we have picked up this misguided notion that somehow these issues, the issues of nature, are stumbling blocks to the gospel. And this is what goes back to something I talked about in episode 1, with this passive formation, where we pick up ideas and emotions about things and not even realizing that we do it. And somewhere along the line, we came to embrace this idea that the matters of nature are not gospel issues. And so, like other things that when we were taught to share the gospel, that we don't want to make them unnecessary stumbling blocks. So things like politics, like we don't want people to stumble over politics unnecessarily in coming to Christ. We don't want to put politics in the mix in such a way that people think that they have to embrace a certain political platform in order to become a Christian. That takes away from the gospel. It's divisive in some ways, and it distracts from the issue of faith in Christ. It distracts from the issue of the exclusivity of Christ and the need for grace and the need for turning from sin and putting our faith in Christ. And we can treat the issues of nature as well. Rather than emphasizing the importance of nature and biological realities and male and female and the importance of upholding the sanctity of marriage, we'll go quiet on those issues because we want to have an inroad. We don't want to create divisiveness with people and break friendship with people so that we have an opening to share the gospel. But as Laverty points out, this understanding of nature and seeing it as a potential stumbling block is misguided. Here's what he writes. I fear that we think the only things worth being hated for are the gospel, our personal piety, and our personal devotion to Jesus. These three things are, we know, non-negotiables, and so we don't mind people stumbling over them. Outside of those, however, we want to bend over backwards so that people aren't unnecessarily hindered from coming to Christ. And this is a noble impulse. But then here, Laverty challenges us. Our criteria for what makes an unnecessary hindrance, however, has become dangerously skewed. Modern evangelicals have long overlooked that the Christian faith requires certain claims about reality and creation, as well as claims about the gospel. And so in a negative world, here's what we need to embrace. That the claims about Christ as creator are just as essential as claims about Christ as savior. These two things go hand in glove. They are inseparable. And so both must be emphasized, particularly in a culture that wants to minimize nature. And here's a really good biblical reference to show you the truth of this. This has been true always, but particularly in our culture today, and we can see the connection made in Romans chapter 1. What does the Apostle Paul do in the book of Romans? This is the highest articulation, the most profound articulation of the gospel found in the New Testament. The Apostle Paul goes into the depths and the beauty of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the gospel of grace in the book of Romans. But where does he start in Romans 1? He starts with nature. He starts with God as creator. He talks about the created order and God's characteristics and his heavenly glory that are put on display through the natural order. And what does he identify as the root of sin? Not worshiping God as creator, worshiping created things rather than the creator. And what happens when we fall into gross sin, such as homosexuality? What is the cause of that? It is a rejection of God as creator. It is a rejection of the natural order. It's rebellion against the natural order as a way to rebel against the creator. So Paul starts grounding the gospel, grounding our understanding of God, our need of grace and the problem of sin in this created order. And then from there, he builds out this beautiful articulation of the gospel of grace and the plan of God to rescue and redeem sinners. But both of these things are held up: God as creator and God as redeemer. Also, what we see in the book of Romans is the scope of the gospel is not just a spiritual scope, but is a physical scope as well. The Apostle Paul talks about Christ restoring and redeeming creation. The creation groans that has been subjected to futility and sin, but through Jesus Christ is going to be set free from that futility. And so the gospel has implications for the created order. And if we minimize that, if we sidestep created order and stop emphasizing the created order, we actually undermine the power and the scope of the gospel. So it is important for us to uphold the created order, one, to point to God, and two, to show how the problem of sin happens when we get out of sorts with the created order. But we also, thirdly, and probably most importantly, we uphold the creative order to show the scope and the extent of the gospel, what Jesus Christ is ultimately going to do when he returns. He's going to restore and renew the entirety of this good created order. So if we're not emphasizing nature, if we're not emphasizing these realities of male and female, then we are not going to properly emphasize the full scope of the gospel. And so, friends, for us to go quiet on this issue is to miss an opportunity to articulate the gospel in a powerful way. We should not fear putting this stumbling block in the way of people, because this is the stumbling block of the gospel, nature just as much as grace. And so we might put it this way: blessed are we when we are hated for the gospel of grace, and blessed are we when we are hated for the articulation of the natural order. Or we might put it this way: blessed are we when we are hated for standing for male and female biology, just as we stand for the exclusivity of Christ. Blessed are we when we are hated for nature, just as we are hated for grace. I want to give a couple implications here. I want to say a few things by way of encouragement and exhortation. The first, we cannot go silent on these issues. We cannot concede to the culture on these issues under some misguided notion that somehow these things are a stumbling block. No, we need to proclaim the goodness of God's created order. Yes, that order has been corrupted by sin, but the good news of the gospel is that through Jesus Christ, God is renewing all things. He's renewing the created order. The men and women who are going to be chewed up and spit out by the new moral order of our society, they're going to need the good news of the gospel that saves not only their souls, but their bodies. They're going to need the good news that through Jesus Christ, whatever harm that may have come through their bodies, that through Christ, that one day they will be fully restored, fully made new. Well, we need to proclaim a fully comprehensive, reality-shaping, creation-shaping, creation-renewing gospel. Second, we cannot allow ourselves to be manipulated by the narrative that the reasons Christians are hated is because we are self-righteous, hypocritical bigots. Now, are there Christians who have been self-righteous and have been jerks? Absolutely. Have there been Christians that have done a lot of harm in our society and have given Christianity a bad name? Absolutely. Are there large segments of Christianity that will continue to do things like this to the detriment of society? Absolutely. This is a sad reality, and we have to be honest about it. But at the same time, we cannot buy into the lie that the reason we are most hated is because of our self-righteousness and our hypocrisy. And we cannot listen to the voices of some Christian leaders that sadly perpetuate this narrative. Now, I'm not saying that they are secretly in league with the world and are trying to deceive the world or trying to deceive Christians because the world is paying them to do it. I think some of these Christians, and I would put guys like Russell Moore and David French in this category, I think they're sincere in their belief that this is the biggest problem. But it is terribly misguided. It terribly misses the time that we are in and what's actually happening in our society. Because here's the game that we need to recognize. That you will, if you take a stand for nature, you will always be deemed self-righteous, hypocritical, and a bigot. No matter how kind you are, no matter how nice you are, no matter how loving you are, no matter how grace-filled you are, you will always be seen as these things. Unless you capitulate, unless you give into the cultural narrative and become affirming, you are going to be labeled, you are going to be hated, you are going to be reviled, you are going to be pushed to the margins ever so slowly. The deck has sort of been stacked. The game has been rigged in such a way that there is no way for us to escape being reviled and being hated if we take a stand for biblical truth. And so we have to recognize we can't winsome our way out of it. We can't be kind enough and loving enough and gracious enough. And I think one of the problems is we think that's our problem, is that we're just not being gracious enough in how we communicate truth. And so yeah, don't be a jerk. Don't be bombastic and a firebrand. The Apostle Paul says in 2 Timothy that the Lord's servant must not be quarrelsome, that they must answer their opponent with gentleness and kindness. And so there is a sense and we want to be this way because these things are the fruit of the Spirit. These things reflect a faith in Christ and a godliness. But don't believe the narrative that if somehow you are being opposed is because you're failing to be those things. No, be those things and expect to be reviled, expect to be hated, expect to be marginalized, because that is what life in the negative world is. How bad will life in the negative world get? Who knows? I don't like to be a doomsday prophet and I don't like to be pessimistic, but it does seem that it is going to be increasingly difficult for Christians to practice their faith out in the open and participate in society. It seems like if the government can't outright outlaw our faith and make it illegal, that they can try more and more to press us to the margins. But even if that were to happen, and even if it continues to get worse and worse, here is our hope. Blessed are you when you are reviled, you are persecuted, and you are hated for the name of Christ. Blessed are you. This means God's favor rests upon you. His power and his presence are with you. Also, in the Gospel of John, what does Jesus say? In this world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world. And so yes, we are going to face opposition. We're going to face those that hate us for our faith, those that are going to oppose us and laugh at us and mock us. But here's the good news, here's the truth, that Jesus, through his death and resurrection, has won a victory for us. He has defeated sin, he's defeated evil, he's defeated death. And one day he is coming back in victory, and he's going to renew and restore all things. What a great hope that we have through the gospel of Jesus Christ. We have confidence knowing this, that the gospel is going forward, that the kingdom is advancing, that people are coming to know Christ and are being transformed. And as we wait for that day for Jesus to return, we can do so with great expectation that he is with us and he is working in us and through us. And so even in the midst of being hated, even in the midst of a hardship, even in the midst of a society and culture that just feels like it is moving so fast and becoming increasingly hostile, we do not need to fear. We do not need to retreat back. No, we can stand faithful and carry out the mission that God has given us. I trust this episode has been helpful to bring clarity to what you can expect to be hated for as you follow Christ and fight the good fight of faith. I love interacting with our listeners, so if you have questions, you have comments, feedback, or if you have a topic idea that you'd like me to discuss, feel free to shoot us an email at disruption@firstcitybellevue.com. Also, be sure to support the work that we're doing here on the podcast. Go ahead and hit that subscribe button on our YouTube page, our iTunes page, and our Spotify page. Thank you for tuning in, and we'll catch you next time for the next weekly disruption.